Alright, hello everybody. Friendly Red here, ready to give my first initial impressions of 2025. We've had a few notable releases thus far in January, but my most anticipated title for the month is up for discussion today, that being Hyper Light Breaker, the latest from developer Heart Machine. A follow-up to 2016's Hyper Light Drifter, this game here has been quite a long time coming. Originally announced all the way back in 2022, and planned for early access not too long after that, the game unfortunately saw many delays and setbacks, causing that launch to be pushed back further and further. But now, right at the start of 2025, the game is finally available in Steam Early Access on PC, and, well, yeah. There's for sure a lot of thoughts swirling around in my head right now based on the time I've spent with the game. But before we get into what I like, dislike, and ideas I have for changes, or things I want to see added or addressed, it's best I give a rundown of what the game is, and how it is structured and played. Hyper Light Breaker is a third-person open-world action roguelite that actually serves as a prequel to the original game, Hyper Light Drifter. While the original game was a solo-only affair, with a top-down perspective and 2D pixel art graphics, Breaker takes the series into 3D, with every character, weapon, building, shrub, and more all being brought to life with those sweet, sweet polygons. While the presentation of the art and graphics has changed pretty significantly from Hyper Light Drifter, the overall style and vibes of Hyper Light Breaker stay pretty faithful to that original game, while of course still standing on its own and being distinct in different ways, not only due to the presentational shift, but also due to being set earlier in the timeline. If you prefer solo play, Breaker still got you covered here, but the game does allow for co-op multiplayer, with up to 3 players taking on the challenges of the overgrowth together. The currently early access version of the game allows players to use one of 3 different characters, though more will be added as time goes on. I've yet to actually unlock any other characters outside of the starter one, but from what I understand, the choice between them doesn't seem to shift up the core gameplay too much. It'll mainly just come down to if one character has a passive or specialization that fits more with your preferred style of play based on weapons you may enjoy using. For example, whether you go solo or squad up, Breaker will task you with conquering that aforementioned overgrowth, which is where the majority of the game currently takes place, and it's certainly an interesting idea for a game world. Essentially, when you start a run, or cycle as the game calls it, you'll be thrown into a randomly generated map, populated with numerous points of interest to explore. These locales will house equipment for you to use throughout your journey, be it in the form of new melee weapons, guns, grenades, or armor to name a few. You'll also be able to find upgrade modules for your character, known as holobites, and these are probably the biggest roguelite element that stood out to me thus far. If you've played a roguelite or like of any kind, then you're pretty familiar with these. Little trinkets that give you some sort of buff or substantial status effects, which can vary in strength or potency depending on the rarity of the pickup. You'll want to explore to not only power yourself up with equipment and holobites, but to also gather items known as prisms, which, once enough have been collected, allow you to challenge the bosses that are occupying different areas of the map. Different bosses require different amounts of prisms, and your ultimate goal to win a run of Hyper Light Breaker is to gather the required amount of prisms to slay all the bosses on the map, which then gives you a chance to face the big bad himself, known as the Abyss King. You aren't exactly bound by any kind of time limit or anything to explore, though the longer you stay on the map, the more difficult it will become, and numerous different world events can occur during your exploration that can potentially hinder your progress in different ways. For example, I've encountered meteor storms that can rain down on certain areas of the map, sudden ambushes from large enemy groups, a mini-boss spawn, and large fire-like domes that, if you stay in them for too long, will cause you to take damage over time. So while there isn't an explicit timer, the game certainly has ways of nudging you to either move it along and get to fighting those bosses, or to extract with whatever you've currently collected and head back to the hub, where you can sort through your inventory and equipment, purchase upgrades, and prepare for another attempt. If you don't decide to extract, however, and end up falling to enemies in the overworld, a boss, or some other health-draining event, you'll lose one of your initial 4 lives you gain at the start of your cycle, and any equipment you have on you will lose 1 durability point, indicated by a white line under the item in your inventory. If all durability slots are removed from an item you have, it'll be gone forever. And perhaps even more notably, if you lose all 4 of your allotted lives, the current cycle will end, meaning you'll have to start a new one, which generates a new map for you to explore, with a different layout and bosses to face. So that's a pretty general overview of the game. Certainly, I think Heart Machine has done a good job of setting this game up to be an infinitely replayable, roguelite take on the Hyper Light formula. But now I think it's best to get into some more specific details and examples of what I think the game is doing right, wrong, and things that I think can be added, changed, or improved. I'm all about positivity, so I think we'll go ahead and start with the negatives first, and then move into what's good before wrapping up here. Based on what I've played of the early access so far, there's 3 major complaints I have regarding the game, those being technical performance, healing, and damage/difficulty. So firstly, as you've probably been able to see based on the footage I've captured of the game, Hyper Light Breaker isn't exactly the smoothest running game on the market right now. Additionally, there isn't really a ton of graphical options or changes you can make to potentially mitigate these performance issues, or at least there weren't any when I initially wrote this section, but a hotfix did drop during the making of this video, which has added more options to change for graphics in-game, as well as some slight overall performance optimizations. The game still isn't where it needs to be, for sure, but it does seem a little bit better, and things are much better now when playing on the Steam Deck, at least compared to the slideshow the game was on launch day when I tried it. The game can now deliver a pretty reasonable 30 FPS experience with low graphical settings, but I really hope that this will improve over time, as I think this game almost demands 60 FPS or higher, due to its rather difficult and demanding nature. Any and all the frames possible are much appreciated. Speaking of that difficult and demanding nature, that leads nicely into my last two major complaints with the game right now, the healing system and difficulty. Honestly, the game probably needs to improve in multiple areas when it comes to explaining things to new players, but healing and how the whole system works is probably one of the more dire ones, I'd say. Especially given how much things hurt in this game. The game doesn't really do a great job explaining how making the healing items work, or even how to obtain them, as you do not start out with an intrinsic healing item or a few healing vials or anything like that. Instead, you are required to obtain an upgrade that allows you to carry a medkit, and then must use materials you find out in the world during a cycle to convert into a medkit, which can then be used to heal yourself, or, if in multiplayer, revive downed allies. The healing also feels rather stingy, too. Like, why do we not at least start out with one intrinsic medkit? Why is gaining more tied to a material you get from picking little flowers out in the world? Even then, the conversion isn't something you have a lot of control over either, as the materials you gain from medkits won't be converted until a new run begins, or until you find a shrine where you can produce more. But even then, you're limited to how many you can make, and the cost increases per medkit produced. So yeah, I'm really not a fan of how the game handles healing right now, and I think the system needs some serious tuning or restructuring in general. Honestly, I think something similar to how healing is handled in games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring would be much better suited than whatever it is we have right now. Start us off with a few refillable vials of healing that we can then upgrade or make better over time as we continue to explore or attempt runs. I'm really just throwing out one of the first few ideas that came to mind, but I sincerely hope that this is high on the developer's list of things to look into and change, because we really need either more sources of healing and/or a better healing system in general. And why is that exactly? Well, to put it simply, things in Hyper Light Breaker hurt. Like, a lot. Difficulty is never an easy thing to get right in any video game, and I'm certainly not opposed to harder, more challenging games. With Hyper Light Breaker being a roguelite, with a focus on continuing to try and get stronger, building up your power and expertise over time, I think it makes sense that, especially now in the early game, you'll feel pretty weak and like everything is too much to handle. Really, I don't think the current game is unfair or anything, but there are lots of little things and annoyances I've noticed while traversing the world and fighting enemies that I do think could use some tuning up. Some enemy attacks feel oddly timed and almost like they change up on you every time you encounter it, even if it's the same enemy performing the same attack. Also, there can sometimes be just way too many enemies appearing at once, making it rather tricky to methodically dodge or parry, leading to more damage being taken. And hey, speaking of the parry, it really doesn't feel too good to use right now, and certainly is nowhere near as reliable as the dodge dash. I pretty much only ever use the dash instead of the parry, and I think that kind of says it all right there. Hopefully this can be improved soon too, as parrying does have benefits over dodging, like giving health back to the player, for example. Lastly, the bosses. I've yet to actually clear any of them yet, but my gripes with them aren't exactly tied to the boss entities themselves, but rather the fact that, without end, all throughout the fights, they are always, constantly spawning ads. It's frustrating beyond belief when ads are constantly spawning and getting in the way of what would otherwise be really cool 1v1 showdowns between you and the boss, especially when you're playing solo. I can maybe understand more ads being present when in multiplayer, as to better balance the fight between multiple players and the boss, but when alone, I think ads should not be present after the initial spawn of them when the fight begins, if at all, in general. Alright, now that we've gotten what the game doesn't do so great right now out of the way, we can focus on the fun stuff. What it does do right. Combat in the game is simple, but pretty satisfying. You've got a good mix of melee and shooting, with multiple different weapon types for both combat methods already available. From spears, straight swords, dual blades, and great swords, to pistols, hand cannons, submachine guns, and more, there's tons of variety to choose from, meaning each cycle, if not each run itself, can be very different from the last, should you so choose. Similarly, exploration is pretty simple, but enjoyable, mainly due to the mix of combat you'll get into, alongside the general movement and traversal mechanics. Aside from exploring on foot, you can use a hoverboard to zip across the ground in bodies of water faster, and a glider to soar around to different locales after jumping off from a higher elevation, a la Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. Most of the important or interesting things to explore and look into are already tagged on your map upon loading in, which is understandable, though somewhat disappointing. There isn't a whole lot of interesting unmarked locales or secrets to discover yet, and I hope this changes as time goes on, because I really quite enjoy moving around and exploring in these environments. And a big reason for that is due to the presentation. The mix of otherworldly, futuristic tech with more naturalistic environments is just such a cool blend, and combined with the incredibly moody, somewhat synthy music and neon-soaked aesthetics, it just checks so many boxes for me personally. And this is one area of the game that needs little improvement, as I think Heart Machine absolutely nailed the look and sound of the world of Hyper Light Breaker. You know, initial impressions are usually meant to be shorter videos in general, but I ended up having a lot more to say about Hyper Light Breaker than I think I would have initially expected. Overall, I do quite like what's here, even if it is far, far from perfect. But hey, that's what early access is all about, isn't it? Giving players the opportunity to try out a new game and help shape its development by providing constructive criticisms, feedback, impressions, and more. Thankfully, looking at the reviews on Steam, most people are doing just that, and I think it's safe to say the developers over at Heart Machine are taking it all to heart. They're constantly responding to reviews, and having already put out a hotfix within the first week is a pretty good sign, I'd say. There is one other thing I should probably point out, which is for sure a pretty fair point of contention, that being the game's price. Frankly, for what you get right here now, $30 is just too much for most people, and I completely and totally understand why many are refunding or skipping out on this right now, given the issues present at launch. Hell, I like the game, but even then, I don't think I can wholly recommend it right now, unless you're just a roguelike fiend or are a big fan of Hyper Light Drifter in general. Of course, I did say right now. I'm confident that later down the line, it'll be much easier to do so, and I have faith in Heart Machine in ultimately delivering a great game here, and I look forward to seeing how it develops and evolves over its early access period. The bones of Hyper Light Breaker are quite strong and calcium-rich. It's just the flesh, sinew, and nerves that need some more work done on them. That might be the strangest analogy I've ever used in my life. Anyways, all that being said, I think that'll do it for this video. If you made it to the end, I thank you for watching. Your continued viewership and support is greatly appreciated. Hope I was able to entertain and inform, and as always, I'll see you next time.